Standing in her grandmother's driveway on a crisp autumn morning, Maya couldn't hold back her tears as she gently ran her fingers along the smooth curves of the 1985 Mercedes-Benz 380 SL. The car's classic silver paint still gleamed in the sunlight, just like it did when she was a little girl sitting on her grandmother's lap in the driver's seat, pretending to steer while making engine noises with her mouth. Her grandmother had always said, "This car isn't just metal and wheels, baby. It's a testament to every no I turned into a yes." As one of the first black female business owners in their city back in the 1970s, her grandmother had faced countless obstacles opening her salon. Banks had denied her loans, landlords had turned her away, and some folks had even tried to intimidate her into closing shop. But she'd persevered, building her business from a single chair in her basement into a thriving salon that employed over 20 people. Maya remembered the day her grandmother finally bought this car. It was 1985, and she'd walked straight into that Mercedes dealership wearing her finest dress, head held high. The salesmen had snickered and whispered among themselves, probably thinking she was lost or couldn't afford anything in the showroom. But when she pulled out a check for the full amount, their jaws had dropped to the floor. That was the sweetest moment, her grandmother used to say with a chuckle, almost better than driving the car home. She'd kept that Mercedes in perfect condition for nearly 4 decades, hand-washing it every Sunday after church, getting it serviced like clockwork, and treating the leather seats with the same care she gave her own skin. Now, at 25, Maya couldn't believe the car was hers. After graduating with her computer science degree and landing a job at a top-tech firm, she'd offered to buy her grandmother a new car. But the older woman had just laughed, saying, "Child, this car is going to be yours someday. It's got too much history to leave our family." Maya hadn't expected someday to come so soon. Her grandmother's passing 3 months ago had left a hole in her heart that nothing could fill. But sitting in the driver's seat now, surrounded by the familiar smell of leather and her grandmother's favorite vanilla air freshener, Maya felt closer to her than she had since the funeral. The leather-bound journal in the glove compartment documented every oil change, every tune-up, every mile driven. Her grandmother's neat handwriting filled page after page, telling the story of this car's life with their family. There were notes about road trips to visit relatives down south, drives to Sunday service, and even Maya's first day of college when they'd packed the trunk full of dorm supplies. As she turned the key in the ignition, the engine purred to life just like it always had. The sound brought back a flood of memories. Learning to drive in this very car, her grandmother patiently teaching her how to parallel park, and the pride in her grandmother's eyes when Maya had finally earned her license. "Take care of this car," her grandmother had written in her will, "and it'll take care of you. Remember, baby, everything we own has a story. This one's still being written." Maya took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and eased out of the driveway. She had no idea that in just a few hours, this cherished family heirloom would become the center of a story much bigger than herself. For now, though, she was simply a young woman carrying forward her grandmother's legacy 1 mile at a time in a silver Mercedes that meant so much more than its metal and wheels. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets of Pine Hills, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Maya drove the Mercedes carefully, admiring the grand houses with their perfectly manicured lawns. She'd driven through this area countless times on her way to work, but today felt different. Maybe it was because she was in her grandmother's car, or maybe it was the way some of the residents were staring a bit too long as she passed by. She'd just turned onto Maple Avenue when she noticed the police cruiser pull out behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. She was going exactly the speed limit, and everything about the car was in perfect order. But then the red and blue lights started flashing. Maya's heart sank as she carefully pulled over to the curb, just like her grandmother had taught her. Through her rearview mirror, she watched the officer approach. He was tall, middle-aged, with graying hair at his temples and a walk that seemed more like a strut. She did everything by the book, turned off the engine, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and waited. Her grandmother's words echoed in her head. "Always stay calm, baby. No matter what happens, keep your dignity." The officer, his nameplate read Reynolds, tapped on her window with his flashlight, even though it was still broad daylight. Maya pressed the button to lower the window, maintaining her composure despite the knot forming in her stomach. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Officer Reynolds demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His tone was sharp, suspicious. Maya noticed he kept looking at the car, then at her, then back at the car, as if trying to solve a puzzle that shouldn't exist. "Of course, officer," Maya replied politely, reaching slowly for her purse. She'd learned long ago that sudden movements during traffic stops rarely ended well. She handed over her license, then reached for the glove compartment where her grandmother kept all the car's paperwork in a neat leather portfolio. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Reynolds ordered before she could even hand him the registration. "May I ask why, officer?" Maya kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "I was following all traffic laws." "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen in the area," he said, his hand resting on his hip near his weapon. "Exit the vehicle now." Maya knew this was wrong. The car had been in her family for decades. She had every piece of documentation to prove it. "Officer, I have all the paperwork right here. This car belonged to my grandmother. She just passed away and left it to me. I can show you." I said, "Exit the vehicle." His voice had risen sharply, drawing the attention of several passers-by. Some had stopped to watch, phones partially raised. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She'd done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. As she opened the door, she made sure her phone was recording in her pocket. Another lesson learned from years of similar experiences. "Place your hands where I can see them," Officer Reynolds commanded, now standing uncomfortably close. Maya could smell his coffee breath as he towered over her. "You expect me to believe this is your car? A car like this?" Right then, Maya spotted her grandmother's favorite keychain dangling from the ignition, a small silver angel her grandfather had given her years ago. Looking at it gave her strength. She stood straight, channeling every ounce of her grandmother's dignity and determination. "Officer Reynolds," she said firmly, "I have every right to be driving this car. I can prove ownership. Would you like to see the documentation now, or should I call my family's lawyer first?" Little did Officer Reynolds know, his next action would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his day, but the entire department's future. And Maya, standing there with her grandmother's strength in her heart, was ready for whatever came next. Officer Reynolds' response to Maya's mention of a lawyer was immediate and aggressive. His face hardened, and without warning, he grabbed the car keys from the ignition. The small silver angel keychain jingled sadly as he yanked them out. "This vehicle is being impounded pending investigation," he announced, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "We've had reports of luxury cars being stolen in this area, and your story isn't adding up." Maya felt her grandmother's strength surge through her as she stood her ground. "Officer, I have the title, registration, insurance, everything in that leather portfolio in the glove compartment. You haven't even looked at them. This car has been in my family for almost 40 years. But Officer Reynolds wasn't listening. He was already on his radio, calling for a tow truck. Maya could hardly believe what was happening. The car her grandmother had worked so hard for, had maintained so carefully, was about to be taken away by someone who wouldn't even look at the proof of ownership. A small crowd had gathered by now. Among them was Mrs. Chen, who owned the corner store. She had her phone out, recording everything. A few other people were doing the same, their faces showing a mix of concern and outrage at what they were witnessing. Maya's hands were shaking, but her voice remained steady as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling my lawyer right now, and I'm also calling Internal Affairs. What you're doing is illegal, Officer Reynolds." The mention of Internal Affairs made Officer Reynolds pause for just a second, but he quickly covered his uncertainty with more bluster. "Go ahead and call whoever you want. This vehicle is being impounded, and if you interfere, you'll be arrested for obstruction." Maya had already dialed her lawyer's number. She put it on speaker, letting Officer Reynolds hear every word as she explained the situation. Her lawyer's voice came through clear and professional. "I'm on my way. Officer, be advised that you are currently conducting an illegal seizure, and everything is being recorded." The tow truck's rumbling engine could be heard approaching, but so could another sound, more police sirens. Maya's heart was pounding, but she remembered her grandmother's words about standing up to injustice. "Sometimes, baby, you've got to be the stone that starts the avalanche." Mrs. Chen had moved closer now, her phone still recording. "I've seen this young lady picking up groceries in this car with her grandmother for years," she called out. "This is wrong, and everyone here knows it." Officer Reynolds was starting to look less sure of himself. The crowd had grown larger, and more phones were pointed in his direction. The approaching sirens were getting louder. His hand kept moving from his belt to his collar, adjusting it nervously. The tow truck pulled up just as another police car arrived. But this one was different. It was marked with Internal Affairs on the side. Maya felt a wave of relief as she recognized the officer stepping out, Lieutenant Rivera, who had worked with her grandmother's community outreach program years ago. Officer Reynolds' face had lost its color. The keys in his hand, her grandmother's keys, suddenly seemed to burn him. The little silver angel caught the sunlight, throwing a bright reflection across his badge. Maya stood tall, her phone still recording, surrounded by witnesses with their cameras, her lawyer on the way, and Internal Affairs on the scene. She thought about her grandmother, who had faced down bigger bullies with nothing but dignity and determination. The car wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of everything her grandmother had fought for, and Maya wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The next few minutes would change everything for Officer Reynolds, for the police department, and for every person who'd ever faced similar injustice. The avalanche was about to begin, and Maya was ready to see it through. The arrival of Lieutenant Rivera changed everything in a matter of seconds. Maya watched as the veteran Internal Affairs officer stepped out of her car, her experienced eyes taking in the entire scene, the gathered crowd with their phones, Mrs. Chen still recording faithfully, the nervous Officer Reynolds, and the tow truck driver who hadn't even gotten out of his vehicle yet. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer, 3 minutes away. "Don't say anything more." But she didn't need to. The evidence was already speaking volumes. Her grandmother's carefully maintained documentation was still sitting in the glove compartment, waiting to tell its story. Lieutenant Rivera approached with the measured steps of someone who'd seen this scene too many times before. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority without raising its volume. "I believe I recognize this vehicle. Would you care to explain why you're attempting to impound a car that's been registered in this city for nearly 4 decades? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, the keys still dangling from his hand. The little silver angel keychain caught the light again, almost like it was winking at Maya. "Lieutenant, I received reports of stolen luxury vehicles in the area. Did you check the registration?" Lieutenant Rivera interrupted, her tone sharp but professional. "Did you run the plates? Did you even look at the documentation when it was offered to you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crowd had gone quiet, everyone holding their breath waiting. Mrs. Chen had moved closer to Maya, offering silent support with her presence. "I'm going to access the vehicle now," Maya announced clearly, making sure everyone could hear her. To retrieve the documentation that Officer Reynolds refused to look at. She moved deliberately, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out her grandmother's leather portfolio. As she opened it, decades of careful record-keeping spilled out. Every oil change, every registration renewal, every insurance update, all meticulously documented. But what caught everyone's attention was the photo that fluttered to the ground. A younger version of Maya's grandmother standing proudly next to the brand-new Mercedes, with a much younger Lieutenant Rivera in her police uniform standing beside her. Lieutenant Rivera picked up the photo, and for a moment, her professional demeanor softened. "I remember this day," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This was at the Community Police Outreach Program. Your grandmother was one of our strongest supporters, always believing that the police and the community could work together for something better." Maya's lawyer arrived just then, briefcase in hand, but the dynamic had already shifted. Officer Reynolds was looking at the photo, then at the documentation, his face a mixture of embarrassment and dawning horror as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The crowd had grown even larger, but now they were witnessing something unexpected, not just a confrontation, but potentially a moment of change. Lieutenant Rivera was already on her radio, calling in a superior officer. The tow truck driver, reading the room, quietly put his truck in reverse and began to leave. "Your grandmother used to say that real change happens when people are brave enough to stand up and smart enough to document everything," Lieutenant Rivera said to Maya, handing back the portfolio. Then she turned to Officer Reynolds. "We're going to have a long conversation about this, but first, I believe you have something that belongs to this young lady." Officer Reynolds looked down at the keys in his hand, the Silver Angel keychain serving as a silent witness to everything that had transpired. The next few moments would determine not just the outcome of this incident, but potentially the future of police-community relations in their city. Maya stood ready, her grandmother's strength flowing through her, as she waited to see what would happen next. The truth started unfolding faster than anyone expected. As Officer Reynolds stood there, still clutching Maya's keys, Lieutenant Rivera's computer in her patrol car pinged with an alert. The department had been quietly investigating a pattern of suspicious vehicle stops in upscale neighborhoods, and this incident had just connected the final dots. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I have something you need to see, Lieutenant," she said, her voice clear and confident. "My store's security cameras catch this whole street. This isn't the first time Officer Reynolds has done this. I've been saving the footage." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Maya watched as Lieutenant Rivera's expression shifted from professional concern to deep determination. Other residents began speaking up too, sharing their own stories they'd been too afraid to tell before, of similar stops, similar assumptions, similar disregard for documentation. Maya's lawyer was busy organizing the growing evidence on his tablet. Mrs. Chen's footage, the witness recordings from today, the past incidents, and Maya's grandmother's impeccable documentation. Each piece was another brick in the wall of truth that was being built. "Your grandmother," Lieutenant Rivera said quietly to Maya, "she always told us at community meetings that change would come when enough people found their voice. Looks like she was right, as usual." Officer Reynolds had gone pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by the realization that he was facing something much bigger than a single traffic stop. His hand finally loosened around Maya's keys, the Silver Angel keychain catching the late afternoon stun one more time. I was following what I thought was a pattern," he started to say, but Lieutenant Rivera cut him off. "The only pattern here is the one you created," she said firmly. "And now we have proof." She turned to Maya's lawyer. "I want every piece of evidence you have. This stops today." More police vehicles arrived, including the chief of police himself. He'd been personally overseeing the investigation into discriminatory traffic stops, and this case had just blown it wide open. The crowd of witnesses had grown, but they weren't angry or shouting. Instead, they were sharing their stories with the officers who were taking statements, creating a detailed picture of what had been happening in their community. Maya thought about her grandmother, about how she'd always said that the hardest changes come from the smallest moments of courage. Here was the proof: one traffic stop, one woman standing her ground, one shopkeeper with her security cameras, and dozens of neighbors finally speaking up. The chief approached Maya, his face showing both regret and resolve. "Your grandmother was a pillar of this community," he said. "She worked with us for years, trying to build bridges. We let her down today, but because of you standing up, we can start fixing things." Officer Reynolds finally stepped forward, holding out the keys. The little Silver Angel seemed heavier somehow, weighted with all that had happened. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine remorse. "I let assumptions and prejudice guide my actions. I'd violated everything that badge stands for." Maya took her keys back, feeling the familiar warmth of the metal and the smooth surface of the angel keychain that had brought her grandmother such joy. But this wasn't just about her or her car anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been wrongly stopped, every voice that had been silenced, every assumption that had gone unchallenged. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the street where so much had changed in such a short time. Lieutenant Rivera was already organizing teams to review every traffic stop Officer Reynolds had made in the past year. The chief was announcing plans for an immediate department-wide review of policies and practices. And Maya? She stood by her grandmother's Mercedes, knowing that today's events would ripple out far beyond this single incident. Change was coming, just like her grandmother had always believed it would. The scene in front of Maya was something she never expected to witness. Officer Reynolds sat on the curb, his head in his hands, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. The tough exterior had cracked completely, revealing a man who was beginning to understand the full impact of his behavior. "I've been on the force for 15 years, he said, his voice shaking as he spoke to Lieutenant Rivera and the chief. "I convinced myself I was just being thorough, doing my job. But looking at all this evidence, I was targeting people. I became exactly what I swore to fight against." The chief stood tall, addressing not just Officer Reynolds, but the whole gathering of officers and community members. Today isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about acknowledging a problem that's been hiding in plain sight. And thanks to this young lady and her grandmother's legacy, we can't look away anymore. Mrs. Chen had brought out water bottles from her store, passing them around to everyone gathered in the late afternoon heat. The simple act of sharing water seemed to break down more barriers as residents and officers began talking, really talking, about what had been happening in their community. Maya's lawyer was working with Lieutenant Rivera, going through case after case on his tablet. "Look at these numbers," he said, showing them to the chief. "The pattern is undeniable. But so is the opportunity to make real change." Officer Reynolds finally stood up, wiping his eyes. He walked over to Maya, but stopped a respectful distance away. "I owe you more than just an apology," he said. "I owe you the truth. I let prejudice cloud my judgment. I forgot what this badge really means." Maya thought about what her grandmother would do in this moment. She'd always said that true change starts with honest conversations, even when they're difficult. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "my grandmother believed that admitting mistakes is the first step to fixing them. What matters now is what you do next." The chief stepped forward, his face serious but hopeful. "Starting tomorrow, we're implementing new training programs. Every traffic stop, every interaction will be reviewed. Body cameras will be mandatory. But more importantly, we're going to rebuild our relationship with the community." Lieutenant Rivera was already organizing the next steps. "We'll need community members to serve on oversight committees," she announced. "We need your voices, your experiences, your input to make real change." Mrs. Chen raised her hand immediately. "Count me in," she said. "I've watched this neighborhood change for 20 years. It's time I help guide that change." Other hands went up too, longtime residents, young professionals, even a few officers who wanted to be part of the solution. Maya watched as her grandmother's dream of community and police working together began taking shape right before her eyes. Officer Reynolds handed over his badge to the chief. "I need to earn this back the right way," he said. "If you'll let me, I want to be part of rebuilding what I helped break." The sun was setting now, casting a warm glow over the scene. Maya's phone buzzed with messages from friends who'd seen the videos online. The story was spreading, but not as a tale of conflict. Instead, it was becoming a story of transformation. Maya unlocked her grandmother's Mercedes, the silver angel keychain catching the last rays of sunlight. She thought about how her grandmother would have loved seeing this moment, not because everything was fixed, but because people were finally ready to start fixing things together. As the crowd began to disperse, Lieutenant Rivera touched Maya's shoulder. "Your grandmother always said that change doesn't happen in big moments, it happens in the small choices we make every day. Today, you helped a lot of people make better choices." The next morning at the police station, the atmosphere was heavy with purpose. Officer Reynolds sat in the Internal Affairs conference room, surrounded by case files from his past traffic stops. His hands shook slightly as he went through each one, writing detailed statements about his actions and motivations. "I need to make this right," he kept saying, his voice thick with emotion as he worked with the investigation team. The tough cop facade was completely gone now, replaced by a man facing his own truth for the first time. "Every stop, every assumption, every person I wronged, I need to acknowledge all of it." Lieutenant Rivera watched from the doorway as Reynolds pored over the files. She remembered Maya's grandmother saying years ago, "True change happens when people stop defending their mistakes and start learning from them." Looking at Reynolds now, she could see that change happening in real time. The chief had called an emergency department meeting. The usually noisy briefing room was silent as he played the videos from yesterday's incident. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, seeing their profession through the public's eyes. Some looked down at their badges, perhaps questioning their own past actions. "This isn't about shame," the chief said, his voice firm but encouraging. "This is about growth, about being better tomorrow than we were yesterday." Officer Reynolds made the brave choice to face his actions. Now it's our turn to examine ourselves. Meanwhile, community members were gathering at Mrs. Chen's store. The small space was packed with people sharing their stories, many for the first time. Maya sat quietly, listening as neighbors talked about similar experiences they'd had over the years. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle that was finally being put together. Back at the station, Officer Reynolds pushed away from the desk, his face showing the weight of what he'd discovered. "Lieutenant," he called out, his voice breaking. "These numbers. I told myself I was being a good cop, following patterns. But the only pattern was my own prejudice. I've hurt so many people." The lieutenant pulled up a chair. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Reynolds looked down at his resignation letter, then at the stack of cases he'd just reviewed. "I want to make amends," he said. "Not just apologies, real amends. I want to face every person I wronged, hear their stories, understand the impact of my actions. Then I want to work with the community programs, share my story as a warning to other officers." In Mrs. Chen's store, Maya's phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Rivera. The department wanted to organize a community meeting, not just to discuss policy changes, but to create a space for healing and understanding. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat, getting everyone's attention. "You know," she said, looking at Maya, "your grandmother always told me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about creating change. Maybe this is our chance to do that." The afternoon sun streamed through the store windows, catching the silver angel keychain that now lay on the meeting table. Maya picked it up, remembering all the times her grandmother had told her that one person's courage could open the door for others to follow. "My grandmother believed in second chances," Maya said to the group. "But she also believed in accountability. Maybe we can have both." Outside, the neighborhood was buzzing with activity. News crews had started arriving, drawn by the story of a community turning a moment of conflict into an opportunity for transformation. But this wasn't just another news story. It was the beginning of real change, built on hard truths and harder conversations. Officer Reynolds was still at his desk, writing his final statement. Each word was an admission, a promise, and a step toward redemption. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was working to earn it, one honest word at a time. The community center buzzed with energy as people filled every seat in the large meeting room. It had been 1 week since the incident with Maya's Mercedes, and the changes were already rolling through the department like waves. The chief stood at the podium, but this wasn't the typical police press conference. This was something new. "Today marks the beginning of our department's transformation," he announced, looking across the diverse crowd of faces. "We're launching a comprehensive review of every traffic stop from the past 5 years. But more importantly, we're here to listen." Former Officer Reynolds sat in the front row, wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 15 years. His resignation had been accepted, but instead of walking away, he'd chosen to stay and face the consequences of his actions. The stack of papers in his hands trembled slightly, written apologies to every person he'd wrongfully stopped. Maya watched from her seat beside Mrs. Chen as one by one, people came forward to share their stories. Each account added another piece to the puzzle, revealing how deep the problems had run. But there was something else in their voices too. Hope, cautious but growing stronger with each shared experience. "I've owned my store for 20 years, Mrs. Chen said when it was her turn to speak. "I've seen good cops and bad cops, but today I'm seeing something different, cops who want to learn from their mistakes. That's how we build trust." Lieutenant Rivera presented the department's new accountability measures. Body cameras would now upload footage automatically. Traffic stop data would be reviewed monthly by a community oversight board. Training programs would be completely restructured, with input from community members. Then Reynolds stood up. The room fell silent as he made his way to the podium, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the moment. "I'm not here to defend myself," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I'm here to show others what happens when you let bias guide your actions. I forgot that this job is about protecting and serving everyone, not just some." He turned to face Maya directly. "Your grandmother's car became the key that unlocked all of this. When I grabbed those keys, I thought I was enforcing the law. Instead, I was breaking everything it stands for. I can't undo what I've done, but I can help make sure it never happens again." The chief announced the creation of a new community relations division headed by Lieutenant Rivera. Its first project, a series of workshops where officers would hear directly from community members about their experiences. Reynolds had volunteered to share his story at each session, turning his mistakes into teaching moments. Maya finally stood up, holding her grandmother's keychain. The silver angel caught the light, throwing tiny sparkles across the room. My grandmother used to say that keys don't just open doors, they open minds. When she bought that Mercedes, she knew people would question whether she belonged in it. But she never let their doubts stop her from driving forward. She looked around the room, seeing heads nod in understanding. This isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It's about the choices we make every day. Do we let ourselves be guided by assumptions, or do we take the time to see each other as human beings? The meeting continued late into the evening, but something has shifted. People weren't just talking about problems anymore. They were working together on solutions. Officers sat with community members, taking notes, asking questions, really listening. As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, Maya thought about how her grandmother would have loved seeing this. The car that had once been a symbol of one woman's success had now become a catalyst for community-wide change. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest transformations start with the smallest moments of courage. 1 year later, the old Mercedes gleamed in the morning sun as Maya pulled into the newly renovated police department parking lot. The silver angel keychain had been joined by another charm, a small badge-shaped pendant, a gift from the community oversight board she now led. Inside, the walls that were once bare now displayed photos of community events and newspaper clippings chronicling the department's transformation. The biggest frame held a familiar image, Maya's grandmother standing proudly next to her new Mercedes decades ago, now serving as a reminder of how far they'd come. The former officer Reynolds, now Mr. Reynolds, waited in the lobby. He'd spent the past year working with the department's new training program, sharing his story with every incoming officer. His face had softened over the months, the weight of guilt replaced by the purpose of prevention. "Ready for today's session?" Maya asked him. They had an unusual but effective partnership now, traveling to other police departments across the state to share their story and the lessons learned. Mrs. Chen bustled in, carrying boxes of fresh pastries for the morning's community meeting. Her store had become an unofficial gathering spot for officers and residents alike, a place where barriers continued to break down over cups of coffee and conversation. 1 year, Lieutenant Rivera said, joining them. Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed. She wasn't exaggerating. The department's new policies had become a model for other cities. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 80%. But more importantly, trust was growing. The meeting room filled quickly. Officers, community members, and representatives from neighboring cities all gathering to learn from their experience. Maya took her place at the podium, the silver angel catching the light as she set her grandmother's keychain beside her notes. "A year ago, a traffic stop could have ended very differently," she began. But instead of becoming another statistic, it became a catalyst for change. "My grandmother always said that real progress happens when people are brave enough to admit their mistakes and humble enough to learn from them." Reynolds stood to share his part of the story. His voice was stronger now, confident not in authority but in authenticity. "I used to think being a good officer meant finding problems," he said. "Now I understand it means being part of the solution." The changes weren't just on paper. The department's new community engagement programs had transformed relationships throughout the city. Officers were regular volunteers at local schools. Citizens felt comfortable reporting concerns. The us versus them mentality had begun to crumble. Lieutenant Rivera presented the year's statistics, but the real success stories were in the small moments, like the young officer who stopped to play basketball with neighborhood kids, or the community members who brought hot meals to officers working late shifts. Maya's phone buzzed with a message from the State Police Academy. They wanted to incorporate her grandmother's story into their standard training curriculum. The ripples of change were spreading further than anyone had imagined. As the meeting wound down, Maya walked to her grandmother's Mercedes. The car that had once been questioned now stood as a symbol of progress. Every scratch, every dent, every mile on the odometer told the story of persistence and change. Mrs. Chen called out from her store's doorway, "Your grandmother would be so proud." Maya smiled, knowing it was true. The The Silver Angel caught the sunset's rays one more time, reminding her that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to keep driving toward a better future. The city had changed, but more importantly, its people had changed. And as Maya started the engine, hearing that familiar purr, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where courage, accountability, and understanding would keep leading the way forward.